these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold these truths.
We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Hey everybody, welcome back. We've got a great show today with Russ Roberts. He's a fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. He's the host of a weekly podcast, Econ Talk. It's really great. I personally am a fan. You learn a lot from that podcast. He's also an author. He's written Gambling with Other People's Money, How Perverse Incentives Caused the Financial Crisis, in which he explores the bailouts and the risk-taking that led to the financial crisis of 2008. He's a three-time Teacher of the Year. He's taught at George Mason, Washington University in St. Louis, and University of Rochester, Stanford, and the University of California, Los Angeles. Russ, thanks so much for being on the show.
Great to be with you, Dan. So
you talk a lot about economics, obviously. That's what you do. And I think that's a pretty, you're a good person to talk to in our current crisis, because while this is a pandemic, we are also in an economic crisis, and it's a unique one for a lot of reasons. It's been sort of forced upon ourselves willingly, where we deliberately shut down the economy, and our actions to thwart that have been what they are. We'll talk about that, and but we also have to talk about how we get out of it and what the trade-offs are, and how does an economist look at this? So we're seeing a lot of political debate and a lot of moralizing over what are the costs to the economy versus the cost to people's health. From an economist standpoint, how are you viewing this debate?
So that's the standard way you hear about this trade-off. It's health, life and death versus, quote, the economy. And that's a pretty stark way to think about it. I think it's actually the wrong way to think about it. We're very focused on life and death. We should be. It's a horrible pandemic. We have a lot of people dying. We see those numbers every day. There's some uncertainty about how they're measured. Obviously, we've now added probable, not just confirmed cases. But we know what those are. Those are people dying in horrible conditions, in pain. It's a bad thing. Nobody wants to die. I'm 65. I'm in one of the, quote, dangerous groups. I'm not obese, but I'm close. So, this is a serious, terrible thing that we correctly and obviously focus on. The other side, though, isn't, quote, the economy. The other side are the human lives that are being harmed, destroyed, degraded, lost, not literally, but human flourishing is being greatly hurt by locking down the economy. We have people who are unemployed, who can't provide for their families or themselves. We have dreams that have been shattered, entrepreneurs, people who started a business, people who start a restaurant or a small business of some kind, suddenly find they have no customers, their revenue dries up, they're going to lose their business, they're going to lose their mortgage, they're going to lose things they've invested and saved for. These are serious. It's not just, oh, well, people commit suicide when the economy goes down. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the fabric of life is really being torn, and people whose kids are not going to school now. There's a huge range of costs that are not easily measured that I'm very worried about going forward.
Yeah, but it also is true that people commit more suicides in a situation like this, and we've seen some data from some counties that have measured that. And I think another cost that is measurable is how many medical procedures are being put off. We see that a lot here in Texas, and our governor has taken some action to reverse what I think was bad policy in the first place. Basically preventing medical care in empty hospitals, and
yeah.
There's a balance here, and there's a strange discussion about risk, and I wonder if we're defining risk correctly and thinking about it objectively, because I hear the Governor Cuomo talk this week, and he's been pretty good and level-headed throughout this for the most part, but then he goes off and starts and shames this reporter during a press conference for asking those same questions that you basically just posed, which is what about the other costs? And he makes this big moral grandstanding type of statement where he says, well, they're basically that every life has to be worth it no matter what. But that's and that does feel good to say, but it's not how we live our normal lives, because I could just as easily say, well, I'm a better person than you because I don't want anybody to drive anymore at all. Yeah. I know they cause tens of thousands of deaths every year. And yeah, it'll be an inconvenience if I tell people to stop driving, but I'm a better person than you.
And when you say that, people respond and say, but automobile deaths don't have the potential to spiral exponentially out of control. And that's true, but that's not the point that I make when I mention things like you're making, like we don't live that way. The point is that the goal of life is not to live as long as possible, because I know this is painful to say and hard to admit, but as I said, I'm 65. I'm hoping to outlive this crisis, but I'm going to die anyway. So life isn't about dying versus not dying. It's about living fully. It's about living well. And just to take an extreme example, I don't want to live for the next 40 years locked down, living off government borrowing and make it to 105. That would not be living. That's not life. So I do think it's important to weigh the non-monetary, non-financial parts of this that are occurring because we have put the economy on a forced vacation. It is, and it comes with huge political risks as well. People who don't get their checks, people who don't have livelihood, it's not just they're going to have bad health or, God forbid, commit suicide. It's that their lives are going to be ruined. They're not going to have dignity. That counts too. It counts in a way that isn't quantifiable, but it counts. And I'd be curious if you're hearing from people about their frustrations, your constituents, right? I'm on Twitter.
In a huge way.
On Twitter, I hear a lot of people like me who are typically have a lot of education, can easily work from home, are still keep getting a paycheck. Their biggest hardship is that there's not enough toilet paper in the basement. I actually have, there's plenty of toilet paper, but my stockpile's not big enough. That's the kind of first world problem that people that I hear from are talking about. We ought to be thinking about. Doesn't mean we're going to do something ridiculously foolish or reckless, but we need to be thinking about ways to listen to the people who are suffering from this lockdown, not for obvious health related reasons, but because we have put the economy on hold.
Well, are you saying you're hearing from people who think we should get back to some sense of normalcy or stay locked down because they're scared?
Most of the people I listen to that I hear are people like me. And I therefore take like me, meaning financially comfortable. I'm blessed and privileged to be comfortable and not be suffering right now. My suffering is that my broadband is being harmed by my wife working from home with two of my kids. That's not hardship. Hardship is you lost your business. Hardship is you lost your job. Hardship is you kept your job, you have to go to work, but your hours are cut and you're having trouble paying for food. Those people are not being heard by people I see and hear opining on.
Yes. Okay.
On the net.
I think that's
you're
true.
Hearing from them.
I hear from the people losing their jobs. I hear from the people who can't get medical procedures. My dad was one of them. He had 90% blockage, couldn't get into a hospital, finally got into another hospital. These hospitals are not full. I keep hearing politicians say, our hospitals are still overwhelmed. No, they're not. Stop saying that. This is not true. It's true in New York. Okay, it's not.
It's true in some locations.
It's not true almost everywhere else. And there's a real fear being spread. And yeah, you mentioned those are the kind of people that you just talked about, the people that I think are being pulled, and which is why you see 60% say no, we should stay at home until it's safe. Well, that's not that's not a very balanced polling question. And also I guarantee everybody who says yes probably has a job or doesn't even know that many people who have lost their jobs. Or did I say that correctly? They definitely have their job, right? And like you said, their biggest inconvenience. And
they've got savings.
Right.
Even if they've lost their job, some people, or they're still working from, but a study came out, I'm sure it's not accurate, but it's close. It's not literally accurate. 37% of Americans can work from home. Okay, that's nice. I'm one of those. Mm-hmm. That means 2/3 can't. Almost 2/3 cannot work from home. Some of them are working right now because they're in food.
Right.
They're in the food supply chain or they're in the medical world. And thank God for them. They should be honored and blessed. But there's a lot of people out there hurting. And by the nature of government, they're not getting a magic check instantly to compensate them for their harm. They're having a hard time. And I'm not, it doesn't mean we should do something reckless. It's not like, well, we got to open up immediately. No, it means we have to think thoughtfully about what limitations we can relax to let some people go back to some kind of normal while still protecting the most at-risk people. We know those are old folks. Old people should stay at home. People over the age of 60 should probably not go out much. If I've been out 3 times in the last month just to buy groceries, nothing else. I think that's smart, wise. I recommend it if you can afford to do that. But for people who either are younger or who can't afford to do that, I think we ought to find ways to help them get back to some economic activity.
Right.
And when I say that, it's like, oh yeah, because money is important. No, not because money is important, because dignity is important, because agency is important, because a feeling that you're taking care of yourself and other people is what's important. And it's okay to have done this for a while, but we got to be thinking about how to do it to stop it sooner than later.
And that balance is important. And when I use the car driving analogy and taking cars off the streets, the thing I'm really getting at, because I can't make the argument you were making about living forever, and I'd get crushed. It's not. I would, as a politician, I really shouldn't be making that argument.
You're a horrible person.
Nor do I. But the argument about the cars is important because, listen, it is very risky. We lose tens of thousands of people doing this particular activity, but we implement risk mitigation measures in order to make it safer, whether it's how we build the cars or how we put lanes in the road and we have traffic lights. There's a lot of the speed limits. There's a lot of things that we put in place to risk mitigate, just as we do throughout our life. As we understand this virus more, we can do the same thing. We understand how to risk mitigate. Maybe it's wearing that cloth mask. It's not touching each other. It's changing up our office space or our restaurants just a tad, so that there's some kind of social distancing, at least for the next couple of months. There's an obvious and I think common sense balance that we can strike to risk mitigate, and I think we have to rapidly get there for the reasons you state. And you've written about this sort of this dignity that is not measured properly in economic literature. So can you talk about that a little bit, and what else are we missing that can't be measured in numbers?
So I'm an economist. I was trained, at the University of Chicago. As economists, we think about what can be measured. We think about statistical analysis. Most economists are trained in mathematical models to try to measure analytically, not necessarily literally, but to try to think conceptually about quantifying well-being. Just think about that phrase, quantifying well-being. And I can do it. Dan, what kind of day are you having today on a scale of 1 to 10? Are you 6, 9, 5.4?
Yeah.
Economists ask those kind of questions.
Right.
I think that's a dangerous question. I don't even know how to think about what that answer means. I don't want the government maximizing happiness. Happiness is not the goal of life. If it were, you'd be drunk all the time, or you'd be on drugs. And of course, people are susceptible to those addictions because part of us wants to be happy. Yeah. But for me, and I think for most human beings, they want more than, quote, happiness. They want something called meaning. They want something called contentment. They want dignity. They want respect. Those are the things that ultimately lead to a meaningful and rich and content life. Yeah. And if we only look at what we can measure, we're going to give short shrift to those things that can't be measured. And I think that is a tragedy of public policy generally, the focus on what can be measured when the things that we know deep down are more important. And of course, if you're not careful, this leads you to saying things, it's doing all kinds of stupid policy interventions if you're not careful. But I think the philosophical point, which I think is crucial, is to keep in mind, which is hard to do, to keep in mind what makes life rich, what is actual human flourishing. It's not your salary. It's not how many goods you can buy. We measure those things as economists because we can, and we like to think they're proxies for a deeper sense of meaning. But we know that, I think deep down, we also know that there's a disconnect there. So nobody's saying, oh, money doesn't matter because money can't buy happiness. That's stupid. Poverty is debilitating. Poverty is misery. Poverty is brutal. Poverty destroys families. It destroys lives. But you also don't want to make the other mistake and say, yeah, all I have to do is give people money. They'll be fine. That's not true either.
Right.
So I think it's very hard for policymakers and for economists to keep in mind the intangibles, the things that give life its full meaning. And, it happens on a personal basis. Think about it all the time. I have 4 children. So many times I don't want to spend time with them. I want to work on my job. I want to get another article published. I want to watch sports. I want to fool around on YouTube, on the internet, and waste time doing that. And my kids pulling on my shirt sleeves and, Dad, let's play chess. Dad, can read me a story. Well, what's the right thing there? And the answer is, in the short run, it's hard. It's easy to say to yourself, oh, I need to get that promotion. I need to get that better career step. And my kid, it's good for my kid that I don't pay attention to him. Got to take that trip. But in fact, the right thing to do often is the hard thing, but it's the right thing, which is to spend time with your kids. Because even on self-interested grounds, over the next X years, 20, 30, 40 years, that relationship is what matters, not your promotion, not your job title, all those things. So it's hard to remember that in the moment. So I think both on a personal level and a public policy level, it's important to remember what can't be measured.
Right.
That is essential to life.
There seem to be lessons there for the left and the right. And I'll kind of frame what I think those lessons are based on what you just said. So on the left, it's pretty obvious that they think that a universal basic income can make somebody happy. Whereas conservatives would say, no, that creates dependency, it removes agency, it removes control over your own destiny, and it's devastating to the psyche. Even though, yes, you might be providing some basic needs, but there's no dignity in that. But on the right, I wonder if we too often focus on hard numbers, on economic growth, and maybe now I think we're right to pursue job growth to the maximum degree, because I think nothing gives you better dignity than a job, and the ability to provide for your family on your own. The question is, is the left right? Are they correct sometimes in saying that not enough jobs are providing that dignity, and that's why they need a bigger social safety net from government? And so a little while ago, I had Orrin Cass on this podcast, and if you're familiar with him and his work with American Compass, and he's making a big push for what he calls an industrial policy, where he believes he's taking conservative principles and applying them to to what he calls an industrial policy, promoting industries that have better paying jobs, more manufacturing, being a little bit more skeptical of libertarian free trade thought, and using that as the route to, I think, building more dignity and wealth amongst lower and middle class. How do you come down on that whole conversation?
Well, I think it's kind of I don't want to call it a fantasy. That sounds a little disrespectful to Orrin Cass's ideas, but I think it's unrealistic to think it's going to turn out the way that he hopes it will. Mm-hmm. But let me react to the way you set that up. So yes, I think the right and a lot of economists spend too much time talking about growth. Growth's really important, but not because of some artificial, wouldn't 3% be better than 2%? Yes, it would be. But the reason it's better isn't because then we'll all have more money. The reason it's better is because it allows more opportunity for people to build their dreams, mm-hmm. to do what they want to do, to use their gifts. That's what gives meaning to life and true satisfaction. And we have if you have a stagnant economy, it's more of a zero-sum game. That gets very ugly very quickly. So there is a lot of good reason to argue for growth. At the same time, I think the right makes the mistake of assuming that, everyone can participate. Well, not if they have a lousy education. Mm-hmm. And not if they come from a horrible home life, and not if they'd have to deal with discrimination. So I think the right is unrealistic often about what's available to people who are in the lower economic parts of the economy. They have a very tough time, and people, I think, fail to realize what it's like to be in those shoes. They think, if I was there, I'd just work harder, I'd stay late at school, that's really hard in those environments. Those people have a very tough time. What we ought to be doing, in my view, is not the Orrin Cass solution. I think is wrong. This industry pays more. Let's have more of those jobs. What I think we need to do is to give people more of a chance to acquire the skills that allows them to participate in the modern economy. Yeah. We have a horrible school system.
Well, and to be fair to him, that's one of his bigger solutions is kind of narrowing the skills gap, I think.
Yeah, well, that's great. I'm all for that. We're not so good at doing it, and we can't seem to manage to do it through the public school system. We've only tried for 60 years to spend more money and get better education, and we've failed miserably the last 3 to 4 generations of inner city children in particular, which I think is a tragedy. But that tragedy is multifaceted. It's not just that they have lousy schools. They also have difficult cultural environments to grow up in. They have bad neighborhoods. They have lack of safety. They also have economic restrictions that we put in place that I think it makes it harder for people to get started. We have a minimum wage law that I think punishes people of low skill. We have occupational licensing that makes it extremely hard for small entrepreneurs with ideas for small businesses to get started. We ought to get rid of all those things. Those are cruel.
Yeah, we got to propose.
I think.
Go ahead.
No, I think we're focused on the wrong things. We're focused on outcomes. We ought to be focused on the process, the ways that we could allow people to participate in a modern economy and give them a chance to thrive.
Yeah. Well, I actually think you agree with Warren Cass on a lot more than you realize. Maybe let me give a specific on
sure.
on maybe what I think because I'm not an expert on what he's actually thinking either. I find that this debate on the conservative side to be rather interesting. And it is a little bit what Trump brought into the conversation, even though he didn't bring it in this intellectual way. I think Warren Cass captures it in an intellectual way, versus what is maybe more of a libertarian approach to how we view economics as conservatives. And so let me give an example here.
Sure.
So I guess if you were to be beholden to a libertarian free trade only style of thinking, you would say that Saudi Arabian oil, they can produce it for $2 a barrel. So why would we even bother producing it, right? Like they can produce it cheaper and more efficiently. So why don't we just import it all from over there? Now that has a lot of problems with it associated with it, of course. So because we have an interest in energy independence, we have an interest in creating those jobs here. They are decent, good jobs. And, there's obvious benefit to that. And so I guess how do we wrestle with those two competing ideas?
I'll make it even harder on me as a free trader. I've defended trade with China now. I defended trade with Japan in 1992. I defended trade with Mexico in 1994. Trade with Japan in the 80s, trade with Mexico in the 90s, trade with China in the 2000s. And each of those times we were told that, oh yeah, if we trade with Japan, they're going to take all the good jobs. That was not true. If we trade with Mexico, we're going to lose all our jobs, especially the bottom. No, that wasn't true. I think a lot of those were scare stories that were pushed by people with a vested interest in restricting trade. And we always have to be careful that we don't allow decent arguments to give cover to people who are really just pursuing their own narrow self-interest rather than the interest of the country as a whole. But right now, let's think about China. We'll come back to Saudi Arabia if you want, but I think China is gives me an even harder time. Here we have a virus that came almost certainly from the international global perspective of free trade in both goods and people. Not so much in goods, but people. Should we stop that? Should we stop trading with China? Well, I don't think we should. I don't think the President of the United States should put tariffs on Chinese goods. I would like to see the President of the United States encourage China to stop their wet markets. I think that's probably a good thing. I'm hoping China will. And if they don't, I think a lot of Americans are going to say, I'm not going to buy their stuff. I don't care whether it's cheaper. So I think there will be a cultural backlash against imports that has nothing to do with free trade policy and tariffs and quotas, but will come from just a natural unease people will have in dealing with that. And that's not irrational. It is not irrational to say, I will pay a premium for something that I prefer to buy because I like where it comes from. Yeah. That's okay. Having said that, you don't want to be confused into thinking that buying from America makes America richer, whereas buying from China makes you poorer. That's not true. So if there's a cultural or an emotional reason, when a World War II veteran says, I don't buy Japanese cars, I don't say, oh, you're a fool, they're better. No, I say, you're entitled to that view, my friend. It would be silly to say you should just buy from the cheapest place if it emotionally disturbs you. China, I think, is a little more complicated. And the real problem I have with the industrial policy people and the people who push for tariffs or who raise flags about how trade has affected American life is that there's not a knob that you can turn to say, we've been at a 9.7 on trade freedom. We're going to go to an 8.7 or a 9.2, right? The actual implementation has to be looked at. It's always nice to say, I want a world where, say, vaccines are easier to find. Yeah, how are you going to get there from here? We should have more testing. How are you going to implement that in a country of 330 million people spread out over the size of the United States? What's your implementation strategy? Oh, well, let someone else figure that out. Well, maybe it's not so straightforward. So maybe if it's not straightforward, that policy isn't as attractive as it looks. So if you're going to say there are some things about trade I don't like, which of course there are, for people, say, of certain types of skill sets or certain types of geographical locations, fine, I agree with you. So now we have a choice. Tell me what we should do that's going to make life better, not what you hope will happen, but what will actually happen. So do you want to put tariffs on manufactured goods from around the world to bring back manufacturing jobs in the United States? I think that's a mistake. That's like, to me, trying to say, let's ban cars so that blacksmiths will always have a job shoeing horses. That's absurd. That's the road to stasis. It's the road to xenophobia. It's the road to fighting among ourselves. I think that's a terrible thing. But also, let's give people the gifts, again, the training and the skills and the opportunities, so that if they can't go to college and can't get a manufacturing job because they're disappearing in America, let's make sure they have opportunities to gain the skills to do something else. But that's where I want to put my energy, right? It's a question of focus, too. It's not, we don't have an infinite amount of resource. We don't have an infinite amount of energy and focus. So you want to be more worried about say, foreign Chinese products that are cheaper than ours, or do you want to be more focused on letting Americans become more competitive? Let's put our focus on that. It's like when people say we shouldn't let immigrants come here to work because they can lower wages for the lowest skilled Americans. There's some evidence for that. Wouldn't we want to respond to that by saying, well, let's give the lowest skilled Americans more opportunity to do better? It's just crazy. It just seems like the wrong, inhuman way to go about fixing that problem. It is a problem. Don't deny it, but let's fix it the right way, not the wrong way.
Yeah. Again, it kind of seems like the solutions that you lay out seem pretty similar to the industrial policy guys. 'Cause I'm not sure I've actually seen Oren Cass even advocate for tariffs. But there would be some evidence. So just to bring it back to China, though, I thought we had seen evidence that in certain geographic areas in the United States, they're very clearly harmed. Even though we see an aggregate benefit to importing more goods and more trade with China, there are definitely places in America that are specifically harmed by that free trade. And I guess as policymakers, are we taking that into account enough? And of course, the question, as you said, is, okay, well, what do you do about it? What is the implementation process? And more specifically, because the conversation right now is with respect to coronavirus, is how do we bring our medical supply chains back home? What does that actually look like, and what policies need to go into place to make that happen? Do we pass a law that says it has to happen, and we just accept that it's going to cost us more money? Is because there's obviously a national security benefit to that for future pandemics. It's, again, similar to the oil conversation. I know there's an obvious benefit, I think. Maybe it's because I'm biased and I'm from Texas, but I think there's an obvious benefit to having this industry and some kind of energy independence. And I can also make the case that there's an environmental benefit for all my left-wing fans out there, of which I'm not sure how many there are. But there's an environmental benefit to this as well. And so, again, the question is, what's the right policies to make that happen?
Let's talk about the oil issue for a minute, and then maybe we'll segue to the supply chain for medical supplies. I think that's a very good question to ask somebody who thinks let's let markets work. And I have been thinking a lot about that issue, especially with respect to masks and so-called PPE. But let's take the Saudi Arabia question. So I agree with you. It'd be great if we bought less oil from Saudi Arabia. And there's at least two ways. There's more than two, but one of the obvious ways to get there is to either ban imports from Saudi Arabia or put a tariff or quota, limit the amount. The tariff is a tax on imports. The quota is a physical limited amount that you allow in. Here's the third way. Let's allow more nuclear power, right? So that would also reduce our dependency on Saudi Arabian oil. That seems to be a non-starter, mainly from people who care about the environment, which
I advocate for nuclear power all the time. Yeah, I'm with you.
I think we need to take more Americans to France. First of all, it's a beautiful country. The food's excellent. It's got a lot of beautiful, great museums. And you could see that life in a country that you get a lot of its energy from nuclear seems pretty good. It's okay. They're doing all right. But it's politically non-starter. So the question is, again, where would you put your energy in trying to make the case for nuclear or for trying to stop imports from Saudi Arabia? And then, of course, there's the third track is that we haven't talked about is fracking. Fracking reduced our dependence on foreign oil. It was a fabulous innovation that very few people anticipated. It's fabulous for the environment, not totally, because, I understand it's got some issues with water and other stuff, but in terms of carbon, it's fantastic. It's increased our ability to produce natural gas, which is much more less carbon intensive than other things. It's been much better for the climate. So there's a lot of arrows in the quiver, and I think we want to always be careful not just to focus on the one, especially when that often has a side benefit of helping a group of people who have stake in it. So I think it's hard to keep the interests of America at heart as a whole, and that's a challenge.
It certainly is. I mean, when the oil and gas debate, I involve fracking in that because the problem is with prices are what they are. Even the fracking industry has the potential to completely go under right now.
Oh yeah.
And with respect to oil, what I remind people of is, it's cheap right now, and I realize you like that. But if we lose all of our production ability, you run the risk of getting back to a point like we were in the 1970s, where you have giant spikes in prices and lines at the pump, and you don't want to get to that. So again, the simple benefit of having an industry at all, I think is worthy of a conversation, as opposed to the sort of theoretical competitive advantage. We should just import it all because it's just cheaper for somebody else to make it. And it's an honest conversation.
Yeah, there's some argument for having some domestic know-how, we might call it. But I don't think, for example, that if the U.S. energy market is taking a terrible hit right now, obviously, especially in Texas. I think it will start up again. The oil's still under the ground. That's not going to change. We have to maintain some ability to pull it out, but I don't think we're going to forget how to do that, or that engineers are not going to be available to the United States. And so there are going to be transition costs for that. I don't want to pretend it's straightforward. You snap your fingers and it just starts up again. But I think you have to be careful again in subsidizing or protecting any domestic industry from foreign competition. I think it's smart to be aware that it's not easy and it's not straightforward. But I think those industries will come back. There are going to be people who lose their shirts, right? Who made a bet and lost a lot of money. That does happen. The other thing I want to mention, I think it's important, those spikes in prices of the 1970s were due to supply disruptions engineered, I think, mostly by Saudi Arabia and OPEC, but I think Saudi Arabia was the driving force behind it.
Exactly.
But the lines that came from that were because of policy decision to not let prices rise. And I think that's very relevant for the world we're in today. And I think it's a tragedy that politicians and individual, voters push politicians to not use prices to allocate goods in a crisis. And I think that's a mistake.
Oh, well, actually, let's talk about that for a second, because as a politician, sure. I see this phenomenon quite a bit, which is, politicians like to buy off voters, and votes are not bought with some kind of corporate overlord slush fund, as many people would think. They are bought with promises, and so this is a cultural phenomenon. You've been around a lot longer than I have, studying these things a lot longer than I have. Has it always been this way, or is it getting worse? Are voters more susceptible now to these false promises than they used to be? Why is a Green New Deal, which is so absurd on its face, like so well received by some circles? Why is there this belief that us politicians are just hiding all this free stuff that if only we were nice and good people, we would just give to you?
Yeah, well, this story's really old. I think, what you're reacting to is a really common phenomenon in a democracy that, first of all, my vote isn't so important, and how I vote as an individual is not. Your vote's much more important than mine, Dan. Just FYI, you're one of 435. I'm one of a few hundred million. So any individual's vote being not so important. Unlike my vote for my car, right? I cast a vote for what car to buy, and I bear all the consequences. If I have a family of 6 and I buy a 2-seater, I'm going to find out very quickly I made a mistake.
Yeah.
When we do make a political error, it's not as easy to fix. The people who paid for it are not necessarily the people who get to enjoy the benefits, and it's that disconnect is the source of much mischief. So when we think about public policy in these areas, a lot of people have, in the case of price controls, an urge for fairness, which I think is a very human and real urge. I think most people don't understand the full implications of their choices when they push for price controls. They only see part of the story, and I think my job as an economist is to help people see the full story. They can still be in favor of price controls after that, as long as they understand what they're getting into. But politicians are naturally just going to react to how their constituents feel, and so my job, I view, is to try to help more people understand the full effects, and then let politicians then react to that. I don't expect you to, a lot of economists think, Dan, let me explain how price controls really work, and then you'll vote accordingly. That's naive. You're going to vote to stay in office, to maintain power, to implement your vision of what you think America should be.
It's not that naive. I think that's how it should be. I try to explain that to my colleagues. HR 3, which is the drug pricing control bill. That is the flagship bill of my Democrat colleagues. It is a price control bill, and I explain constantly how price controls always reduce supply. That is a simple truth. It's true with the Medicare for All debate. It is the simplest way to explain this. If you control the price, it reduces supply. As you mentioned, the reason there was long gas lines was because there was less supply, because we tried to implement price controls. This always happens 100% of the time. It's like impossible to escape, and there are second, third order effects. And so, no, I'm not going to give politicians the grace that you just did and say, well, they need to get elected. No, they need to tell the truth, and they need to lead. And I am happy to tell people something other than what they believe they should be hearing from me, as long as it's true and based in evidence.
Yeah, good idea.
Thank you. So actually, it's because I know you don't have a whole lot of time left, but I really wanted to ask you about because this is along the same theme of exposing the truth. Let's get to the bottom of the evidence, and let's move past the sort of the feel good talking points. And you've done a lot of work on intergenerational income mobility throughout one's lifespan versus the narrative that if you're in the bottom quintile of earners, basically your income just hasn't changed in something like 40 years, and it's evidence that our system is completely broken and needs to be revolutionized. So unpack that for us, please.
What do we have till next Tuesday to talk about it? It's a long conversation, and there's so many interesting aspects to it. I'll try to pick out a few highlights, though. First thing that people should know is that when you see a chart, any chart from the left or the right that says middle class is doing great, middle class is doing horrible, middle class is stagnant, poor people are doing horrible, all those charts, there's about 15 assumptions behind those charts that every person who makes a chart has to make. 15 decisions. Should I include savings? Is it wealth? Is it income? If I do income, should include bonuses. If I correct for inflation, which I have to if I'm going to talk about progress over time, what measure should I use? Well, a price index. Which one? It makes an enormous difference. And I think all of them tend to overstate inflation because they do not correct for quality changes. What should I include elderly people in that? Because their wages are pretty stagnant, right? Because most of them aren't working. That would bias it in a certain direction. How about households versus individuals? In the United States, since 1970, we had a huge, especially 1960, but even through the 70s, we had big increases in divorce. So we added a lot more single-family households, single-person households, a lot of households that only have one individual in it. Well, that's going to change median household income for no other reason that there's more people with one income than two. People say, yeah, but so many households today have two incomes that you have to have two incomes to get by. Yeah, guess what? I mean, this is shocking, but there are about the same number of two-income households in America today as there were in 1980. Oh, that can't be. So many more women are working. Yes, they are, but there's a lot less marriage.
Yeah.
You don't correct for that. You've made a misunderstanding of what the data are telling you. So when you see that chart, you might ask, I wonder how they defined income. I wonder what they included. Did they include people who don't work certain ages? Is it full-time workers? Is it men and women? Does it include a correction for inflation that makes sense, et cetera, et cetera? And when you look at the studies that are done that are trumpeted about and waved around and bludgeoning people with dramatic conclusions, and you look carefully at what they do, it's not that they're wrong. It's not like people are lying. They're not. But they're making a set of assumptions that gets to a particular answer. When you relax those assumptions, you get a different answer. So the middle class isn't stagnant. People, by the way, more important point, people move up and down the income distribution all the time. So when I say the rich, when people say things like, well, the rich have gotten all the gains since 1990, that implies, and it's misleading, and I think I have to wonder if it's deliberately misleading. When you say the rich have, quote, gotten all the gains, it makes it sound like in 1990, there were a group of people at the top who said, hey, let's see what we can do to get ahead. Let's keep more stuff for ourselves. And then by 2020, look how much more they have. But it's not the same people.
Right.
It's not the same people called the rich. So what is true, the rich in 2020 are richer than the rich in 1980. But it's not like the rich got richer, a particular group got richer. The category of the richest people is a little better off, and sometimes a lot better off than it used to be. That can be really good.
I'm not sure what's
really
wrong with that.
Yeah, there's nothing. It depends how they got richer, right? I love that Sergey Brin and Larry Page, who created Google, which is most of the time a wonderful thing, not every minute, but often a wonderful thing. I'm glad they got fabulously rich from it because I got rich too from that. I got a lot of things I value from that. I'm glad that Steph Curry makes more money than Larry Bird or Magic Johnson did. And why? Because Steph Curry, the basketball player, is entertaining people in China, and Larry Bird and Magic Johnson couldn't. So, and that's true for Tom Hanks, and it's true for Adele. And it's a more global world. You can make a lot more money if you're near the top or one of the best.
Okay, so then let's follow
people on.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, what I don't want are people who use crony connections with government to get special favors that keep out competitors. That's the wrong way to get rich. That inequality that comes from that, or that gains to the top, are horrible. We should stop doing that. We should stop subsidizing rich folks and people in the world of finance through bailouts and other things. That's a mistake. But don't then say everything that's rich is bad because they obviously are exploiting other people. No, they're not. Often they're serving other people, and they're doing it so well that they're making a lot more money than people like that used to.
Right.
That's the key point.
Well, then let's follow the people who were poor in 1980 and those same people, that same group of people in that bottom quintile, and ask what happened to them. Did they stay in that bottom quintile, or did they improve?
So what most people do is they take a snapshot of the whole population in 1980. Then they take a snapshot of the whole population in 2020, and they compare the bottom 20% in 1980 to the bottom percent, say, in 2020. They're not the same people. There are a lot more immigrants, people with lower skills when they came here. They came here not because they thought they were going to be exploited by the rich. They came here because they thought they were going to make a better life for their children, and they often do. And it's a beautiful thing. And the fact that they have lower skills when they get here, or less education, and that pulls down the measured level of the bottom 20%, that's the wrong thing to be looking at. What we ought to be looking at, as you suggest, is let's say the people were poor in 1980, and let's see what happens to them over their life cycle relative to richer people in 1980. And what happened as the economy unfolded as we went through were really good years of economic growth in the 80s and 90s. And the answer is everybody got better off when you follow people over time rather than two snapshots that has different groups of people in it. And as you know, we talked about this before we went on the air. I've done a set of videos that people can look at to try to see how these statistical distortions make it hard to measure what's actually going on. But the rising tide has lifted all boats. We could debate about the people who didn't gain, who got left behind, and we talked about that earlier. I think that's a tragedy.
And then the question is why, right?
Who can't get the skills, right, to be part of the economy. Those are real. That's really important. And I think too often when you look at the average or growth as a percentage overall, that's the wrong thing to look at. We ought to be focusing on the people who are really struggling. But that's more important than a measure of inequality that lumps in people at the top who did wonderful things with people at the top who were basically used the government to thieve from the rest of us. So I think I want to help people I care much more about the opportunity of people to get ahead than the opportunity to get ahead of others. That's the worst part of human nature to appeal to.
And we ought to be resentment.
Resentment, and it's and jealousy, and it's destructive, it's corrosive, and politicians really should not encourage that. I think it's a demagogue.
They do a lot more. They do a lot more than encourage it. I mean, it's the basis for the revolution. it is you have to convince people that somebody is oppressing you if you're going to convince them that they need to implement the most extreme of policies. It's a terrible trick played on the American people, and I wish it would stop. In your limited time, I want you to go back to some coronavirus, if you don't mind, and react to what we have passed yesterday, which is basically just an expansion of the policies that we passed in the first CARES Act. I have a number of things that I think are wrong with the policy, although overall it probably does its job. What are your general thoughts? And if we were to design this perfectly for next time, given the situation we're in, which we basically forced a pause on the economy and we needed to keep it alive temporarily, what would be the right way to go about this if there weren't if there were no politicians involved and just experts like yourself?
Yeah, you're kind. Again, I think there's a temptation to look for magic. If you're going to tell people they can't work, you better give them a way to compensate them in the meanwhile. To me, it's the equivalent of eminent domain or takings. Yeah, I agree. And we don't have an easy way to do that. I worried about that when the first CARES Act came along. I knew it would take a while. We knew from past rebate checks and other things that there were problems with that, and it wasn't as likely to be. It wasn't going to be swift. We had a second problem with it that you have to run it. You don't just set up a lemonade stand and hand out money. There's got to be paperwork and forms. And big surprise, some of the banks handed out money to their friends rather than to people who deserved it. Mm-hmm. Not surprising. Part of the game, unfortunately. And I think you have to be realistic when you put in policies like that in place to understand that it's not going to be implemented magically, that every single person in 24 hours will have $1,200 put into their bank account electronically. Not easy to do.
But is that even the right? Like, what do you even think about the direct cash payments? $1,200. It's kind of means tested, but it's not tested based on whether your income has changed because of coronavirus.
Yeah, I don't know. There's no easy, as I said, there's no sort of simple, obviously great way to do it. So I think anything you choose is going to be imperfect like that. I do think it was a good idea to give people a cushion. But the thing I worry about on the side, we don't have $2.2 trillion to hand out every couple months. I know there's a feeling that that's capable because nothing bad happened the first time, but that's kind of what happens when you have a debt crisis. Everything's fine until it isn't. So these people are saying, oh yeah, we just keep printing money. We keep borrowing money. It's fine. We owe it to ourselves. We do take a risk there of serious social disruption. We're at risk of hyperinflation. We're at risk of the U.S. having trouble keeping its promises because people don't want to lend them money anymore. Right. So although those have not happened yet, and you don't want to be a fear monger about it, you don't want to pretend it's not a possibility. So I think it's really important to find ways to minimize how much money the government's got to spend over the next 6 months.
Yeah, okay, we can talk about that. Yeah, because you're surprisingly uncritical of some of the policies that were in the CARES Act. I was expecting a little bit more of a more critique of what we did there. I certainly have my own, but again, obviously I voted for it. So,
but Dan, I think the question is, if we had a choice and we decided to give the government at the federal and state level the power. When I say we decided, the people with that power decided to use it. They could have taken a different approach. They could have said, this is a dangerous time, act accordingly. That's what used to happen in a free nation. We're not exactly a free nation anymore. So what we said was, by the way, a lot of things happen without government, right? Churches and synagogues shut down across the board in a lot of places, well before the government shut down things, well before school systems were shut down. The NBA shut down, the NCAA basketball tournament. Those were all canceled before state and federal decisions were made. But once you have a federal decision that says you can't have a restaurant, I don't think we are not prepared. This comes back to our discussion we haven't had yet about stockpiling medical devices. But given that we're not prepared, it's really hard to say, well, let's just let the market handle it.
Oh, no, that's not what I'm suggesting at all. I'm just wondering if there's around the edges, if we could have gone about some of these ideas slightly differently. was the way that we implemented the unemployment insurance, the changes. Were those good or bad? And we're seeing pros and cons to that right now. Is a direct cash payment really the right thing to do to stimulate an economy that you're actually telling people not to consume? And you're telling people they can't even spend the money at stores. So why would we hand that out? And is it too little money for the people who need it and too much money for people who don't need it? These are the questions that I wrestled with.
Well, I think those are good questions to wrestle with. I don't mean to suggest that it was well designed. I think it's really hard to do. I think the idea of giving people when you force people to not go to work, the idea of giving them enough money to pay for food and shelter seems to me to be not the worst thing in the world. To means test it better, yeah, for sure. To make sure that it's the right magnitudes and that you have a strategy for ending it would be a really good idea. Part of the problem, of course, is just that I don't really have a great idea what's going on. We don't know how long it's going to last. And I don't mean it, meaning the lockdown. We don't fully understand the parameters of the disease. We don't fully understand how contagious it is, whether you have to be in a group. We don't know whether masks can mitigate it. I think there's a lot of suggestive evidence that it might, which would allow us to shorten this rather than lengthen it, the lockdown. Mm-hmm. But I think that we ought to be spending some energy and money on those things. And I hope we are.
I think we are. You mentioned supply chain. So again, we did forget to hit on that. So I mean, what would be your ideas on how would we best implement policy if our goal is to bring some of these supply chains back home?
So we've done a terrible thing in the United States, in my view, as a believer in the power of decentralized systems to help make people's lives better. What we've done is we said we're not going to let prices work in certain situations. We're in one right now. I know that the Attorney General of Texas threatened an auctioneer who had 750,000 masks in a warehouse of price gouging, and therefore, as far as I know, they're still sitting in a warehouse. Most states, I think 30-something states, have laws against price gouging, where price gouging is defined to be often, I happen to know California's, you can't raise your price more than 10%. And that's considered compassionate, right? Because obviously people in a time of crisis, it seems cruel to make them pay a premium for something they desperately want or desperately need. But there's also cruelty of holding the prices down because you destroy the incentive for people to make more of the stuff. And that's desperately what we want more of those things, the masks, the gowns, the ventilators, whatever it is. And so now some companies are producing anyway because they think it's good for their reputation, or they're worried about the president shutting off their nationalizing it with the Defense Production Act. So there are, like 3M is making a lot more masks, which is great. But I wish they could have made a lot more money selling those masks. They're not raising their price. They've been encouraged to not let their distributors raise their price. And what that means is it encourages hoarding, which is horrible. It's a big problem, as we've seen in the toilet paper market and other consumer products. It's a bad thing that we are effectively living in Venezuela here in America, because Venezuela doesn't like prices either. Now that we've seen what happens when you don't let them work, you get empty shelves for certain things, and it's weird and encourages people to act irrationally and to hoard stuff. So I think that's a terrible thing. If we let prices rise, both legally and culturally, if we said, yeah, it's okay to make money in a crisis. In fact, I'm grateful that 3M or Prestige Ameritech, which I know is in Texas and makes masks, I'm glad that they're making a lot of money because they took risks beforehand. They built a lot more capacity than they needed because they knew that if a pandemic came, but we don't have that capacity now. They're all scrambling. And that's what happens. It's so easy to look at the short run impact of something. Mm-hmm. The longer run impacts are devastating. And I think we often forget that. And in the case of prices generally, I think people think, oh, you're going to let people exploit other people. No, I'm going to let them make a profit for doing their job. And that profit's not going to last long because we're going to allow other people to come into that market and supply the goods. And the price will come back down quite a bit. So it's really about price and quantity. It's not just the price we care about. We care how many masks there are. And we created a disincentive for people to create more masks, to create more gowns, more ventilators, and so on.
Yeah, there's also a question of what hospitals were spending their pandemic preparation money on, because there is a lot of federal money that does go directly to hospitals to prepare for these things. I know here in Houston, they did prepare. No hospital here has an issue with PPE. We've also not been overrun. We have very few cases compared to other major cities, but I continuously monitor this and ask the hospitals, and they say we ordered this stuff a long time ago because it turns out we took some personal responsibility and decided that would be a good idea. But all that's about price gouging, and I totally understand that concept there. But as far as, and this gets back to the conversation about what does an industrial policy look like? If we want to say we are going to produce 3M's mask in America, not in China, we're going to produce these generic drugs in America, not China. Again, there's a lot of ideas out there on how you would do that. You could just pass a law that says we're doing it, and so figure it out, companies. Or there's tariffs. You could offer credit for companies to bring back. I mean, but what's, from an economic perspective, what's the most efficient and effective way to do that?
Yeah, the problem is you have to work within the constraints of what's a very bizarre system. So let's talk about hospitals for a minute, right? The analogy I like is there's a hospital in New York City that's more than one that's struggling with this, right? Mm-hmm. You're lucky. Texas has a few cases, but a lot of hospitals around the country in certain hotspots had shortages. So normally what you do in a hospital when the Purell runs out or when the mask box is empty, you call the supply room and they send up another one. You never even think about it, right? It's like the rest of our lives. It's a wonderful thing. But in a crisis, all of a sudden, the distributor's out of them because a lot of people are calling them, right?
Right.
So I think there's a romance that what we need is a national stock room. Wouldn't it be great? Okay, my distributor doesn't have it. My basement supply in the hospital's empty. Manufacturers have run out. Oh, I'll get one from Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam has a big stockpile. So there's a temptation to do that. The problem is, what do you put in it? How many? What kind? Who should be in charge of that? And in a free market system, the hospitals were in charge of it, right? Not literally. There's no czar of masks.
Right.
There's no czar of pencils. We don't run out of pencils. When China, I like to use the example, when China decided to send kids to, when Chinese families moved to cities, 400 million people or so moved from the countryside of China into the city, a lot more kids were going to school. A lot more kids were going to use pencils. How come we didn't run out here in the United States? Why wasn't there a pencil shortage? How come you go to Staples and say, I need 2 dozen pencils for the start of the school year? And they'd say, what do you mean? China got them all this year. They had a big migration. Doesn't happen. We got plenty of pencils. Why are masks different? And one of the reasons masks are different is our hospitals are not like Staples. They're very strange. They're kind of free market. They're semi-private. They're called nonprofit, some of them, some are for-profit, but that's not the distinction. We've killed the incentives of prices in general in our whole medical system. We've ruined competition among hospitals. We've required many hospitals to have certificates, in many states, to have certificates of need, which is a bizarro thing where if you want to start a hospital, you have to get permission from the existing hospitals in your state. Well, guess what? They think it's a bad idea. So there are many, I'm sure you're aware of this in Texas and in other states, there are many areas in rural America where there's only one hospital and it's far away. And guess what? It has a lot of power. And so they're very bureaucratic. They're not nimble. And what this crisis has exposed is the non-nimble nature of the American medical system. It's very much a government extension of the government bureaucracy. I'm sure you know this. Many, many people tried to sell masks to hospitals in the places that were having shortages. And the hospitals said, yeah, we'd like them. We'll buy them. And the manufacturer said, great, send us some money. Oh, we can't do that. What do you mean? We need a purchase order. You need to send us the money first, then we can make them. We don't do that. Are you kidding me? You got people dying, your doctors and nurses, techs, they're dying from exposure to this disease, and you can't figure out a way to get the money to the manufacturer to get the mask? Something's wrong there. In fact, the really part that's wrong is that in American hospitals, too many of them, you got the doctors on the one side doing a bunch of work, God's work. It's a glorious, wonderful thing they're doing. They have no idea what's happening in the budget office. None. They have no incentive to. The CEO has no incentive. You know why? Because the people those doctors are helping, they're not paying the money. The money's coming from Medicare and from insurance companies. And so the customer isn't the patient. The customer is the government and the insurance company. That disconnect leads to all kinds of stupidity, inefficiency, waste, and non-nimbleness, an inability to act with urgency. So that's the tragedy, I think, that's been unmasked, if I may use a terrible pun, by this crisis. The inability of these folks to respond to, I mean, can you imagine? I literally can't imagine it, that in a situation of life and death, they can't be more creative, but they've struggled to do that. And I've heard that from people on the front lines, some of them who've told me quietly off the record because they're afraid they're going to ruin their reputations, being critical of the hospital system. But it's a problem. So when you ask, what should we do to fix it? The normal things that you would normally do, which would be, well, why do we have to fix it? There's going to be an incentive for hospitals to stockpile. There's incentives for states to stockpile. That's not going to happen. We've taken the profit out of those things. They're going to expect to be bailed out like they are being bailed out now by state and government activity. And we have a crazy thing in your state. This blows my mind. Prestige America, which is a mask maker, was not running night shifts and not running weekend shifts. The CEO said that's because the last time we did that, the Chinese undercut us, coming back to our trade discussion earlier. So we're not going to do that. Well, I guess you wouldn't if you can't charge a higher price, which is against the law. Okay, so they're not going to do that. So what has happened in Texas? Governor Abbott this boggles my mind. Governor Abbott has got the Texas National Guard is going to work in the mask factory to make masks for first responders and others in Texas. I mean, we're in a weird hybrid system that isn't very well done. So what should we do? Well, unfortunately, we probably should stockpile at the federal level for the next one. Having said that, a doctor I got into a debate with on Twitter started to complain to me about what he called Trumpolators. Those were ventilators in the federal stockpile that weren't well maintained. And I'm thinking, you think any president's good at maintaining the ventilators?
Right. It's definitely Trump's fault. It's definitely Trump's fault.
Well, yeah, the Canadian system, strangely enough, they messed up their stockpile of PPE. So, I think the idea that somehow, again, we'll have this magic, beautiful, clean room with all this stuff stockpiled and we'll make sure every 2 weeks that it's in good shape, it's probably not going to work either. Here's to me that one of the unfortunate bottom lines of this, we have a lot of entangled and ineffective places where the private economy intersects with the federal government in ways that lead to stupidity and inefficiency and whatever. That's the way it is. We're not really good at preparing for things that are coming later. What we're really good at is going full bore once the thing descends on us. So I know, I have mixed feelings about the pharmaceutical industry's ability to price. I probably wouldn't. I haven't seen that bill, but I probably wouldn't like the bill you mentioned earlier. But having said, even though I think we sometimes have policies in place that give too much preference to pharmaceutical companies, right now, somebody said to me yesterday, we need a Manhattan Project for vaccines and treatment. It's happening.
Yeah.
Every pharmaceutical company is devoting incredible talent. Forget money. They're doing money too, but more important than money are trained chemists, biochemists, virologists, epidemiologists are working probably close to around the clock at the best pharmaceutical companies around the world because they think they can find a treatment or a vaccine for this. That's our stockpile. Our stockpile, because we've overpaid, I think, for pharmaceuticals in the past, we've created this enormous stockpile of talent. I think it's probably too big, but it pays off now in the case of a crisis. And we have lots of ways to respond to that. Elon Musk making ventilators is another example, or Ford or GM making ventilators or protective masks. There's a lot of know-how in America that springs into action. But what we have to be careful about is to not reduce the incentives for that know-how to get applied. And what helps to get that applied is profit. There's also fame, and there's the feeling of doing a good thing. So They don't want to minimize the importance of those things.
Human incentive matters in the when you're making public policy and trying to analyze human nature and what makes people tick. Incentive actually matters. Imagine that.
They do.
But
I'm willing. But I can see there's more than just financial incentive. There are other kinds, but financial incentives matter if you have to lay out money to get things to happen.
Right.
And so I think we've taken too much of the profit out of certain aspects of the medical system, and we've allowed other parts of it to, I think exploit a lot of folks through bad legislation, bad policy.
Yeah, and speaking of the ventilator thing, is our hospital system discombobulated? It certainly is. But if you compare us to other countries, and these numbers came from you actually, which was just comparing the number of ventilators that we just already had pre-crisis in this country per capita compared to other countries, we have a lot more. We just do. We have a lot more. We generally have
too many.
We have better IC, and now we have way too many because we just started producing like crazy. And we also have more ICU space. We have more capacity. We have a better system because even though it's not a free market system, as you noted, it is still profit driven to an extent, unlike all of these other socialized medicine countries. They live in our garage. I mean, they live off of our innovation and our innovation and
our market. So, there are some great, when I talk about the why it'd be a mistake to go to, say, a single payer system, people say, well, but that's going to take all the profit out of medicine, which means there's going to be less innovation. And again, I think we have too much profit of certain kinds in medicine. I don't want to suggest that somehow we don't have anything close to a free market system, but that doesn't mean that therefore it would be better to move towards socialism. But if we move to a more single payer system, people, we're going to have a lot less innovation. And people say, oh, why is that? We have German drug companies. There's a lot of great. Yeah, you know why there's German drug companies and Swiss drug companies? Because they sell products here where prices are free to be paid. They're high. Now, I think they're too high for other policy reasons, but don't pretend we're not going to have less innovation. We're going to have less innovation.
Yeah, every study shows
we're about
that.
We're about half the world's drug market. Everybody else buys at the national level, negotiates a price with our folks.
Yeah,
and if that's a bad system too. That's a terrible system.
Yeah, you definitely can't afford a drug that doesn't exist in the first place, which is
that's a really good point.
And that's a problem. So, and that's a great place to end. We could probably talk forever about healthcare. I've got a lot to talk about there. But Russ, I really appreciate the conversation and your insight and your work. It's very invaluable. Where can people find you?
econtalk.org or Econ Talk. If you look for podcasts wherever fine podcasts are sold, in my case, given away, we don't charge for it. So iTunes and elsewhere. I archive all my work at russroberts.info, and you can follow me on Twitter at Econ Talker, Econ Talk ER, Econ Talker.